So there we are. All right, we are in the last little part of the first half of Mark, mission with the authority of Christ. We just kind of gave a little reprise of this. Jesus calmed the storm again. And now we come to this text, a rather lengthy text in Mark chapter 7, which I'm calling Defilement, Tradition, Paren, and Gentiles. This is paving the way to ministry to the Gentiles, just as we see something like that happening in the book of Acts. Mark tells us when they had crossed over, they came to the land of Gennesaret and anchored there. They crossed over from Bethsaida to Bethsaida. Remember that? There's two Bethsaidas, one in Iturea off to the east, one in Galilee. It's kind of opposite each other at the very northern tip of the Sea of Galilee. Apparently the storm blew them off course a little bit, so they actually wound up slightly south of that other Bethsaida in a region that's called Gennesaret. It's in Galilee. It's a beautiful region. I don't know if anyone in the room has visited. If you travel in the Holy Land and visit the Sea of Galilee, it's a common place to visit. It's about 3 miles long, about a mile wide. It is just on the western tip of Galilee. In the Old Testament, it's sometimes called Chinnereth, so you'll run into it there. It's a beautiful place, so if you ever happen to want to have a picnic on the Sea of Galilee, that's the place to visit. When they came out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him and ran through that whole surrounding region. They began to carry about on beds those who were sick wherever they heard he was. Notice the extravagant language that Mark uses here. The people recognized Jesus, they ran, and they carried on beds. It's just quite a sight if you imagine it. There's a shockwave sensation that's kind of just bubbling beneath the surface here as Mark tells the story. It's an extraordinary phenomenon. All of these people now hear that finally Jesus has arrived. And so in a kind of swooping pell-mell rush, they want to get to him, especially bringing those who are sick. We think of the life of Christ in terms of the great events of the gospel. We think of Jesus dying for our sins, rising from the dead, and so on, as rightly we should. At the time that Jesus was living, however, before all of those events had happened, he was best known as a healer. That's what people thought of. They knew he said some amazing things. They didn't quite get all of it. They weren't quite so sure what to make of this kingdom business. But the one thing they knew for sure, this man could heal whatever ailed you. I think we have to agree that if somebody were around that could do the same thing today, it would have the same effect. We appreciate the healing arts and how much advances have been made in medicine. The MDs in the room, we are deeply grateful for your good training and the help we've gotten. But I think we all agree medicine, even in its present state, has its limits. And if we knew there was somebody coming to town and you could just touch his clothing and be healed of anything, the most debilitating disease, the most crippled body, the most deranged mind would just immediately be healed. Can you imagine the sensation that would be sparked by that? We'd have a similar phenomenon today. And that's what Jesus was known for. He was known as a healer. People didn't always get what he was saying, but one thing we know for sure, they took it seriously to the extent they could understand it, because anyone who could do these works must have something to say that's important. And from a biblical point of view, the works, in a sense, function to attest to and prove the truth and the weight of the word. So here, as elsewhere, we find this remarkable response as people are coming to be healed. Mark tells us wherever he entered, into villages, cities, or the country, they laid the sick in the marketplaces and begged him that they might just touch the hem of his garments. And as many as touched him were made well. So here's Jesus, as I've said in Mark, a man of action and compassion. He's moving. He's going to the villages, the cities, the country, small towns that were in that region. And in all of these places, people are gravitating to him. It's a wonderful picture. St. Francis was especially touched by this text when he saw a picture of Jesus moving in the villages and communities. He, of course, had to buck the trend of his day to say, let's take the monastery out into the streets. Let's quit making people come to us. Let's go to them. And in many ways, it was the inspiring picture that we have here of Christ that moved him and others to join in that kind of effort. They laid the sick in the marketplace. The Greek word here is the agorais. You know the word agora? It's the Greek word for a marketplace, the ancient version of a mall. That's where Jesus is. He's where people are shopping, milling. He's not running from the people. He's going to them. And what we hear is that people come just wanting to touch his clothing, reminding us of that woman who came and simply wanted to touch the hem of his garment. It was rudimentary faith. Faith is at its most elemental level. They come, they simply want healing. They're not so sure about all the theology. They don't quite understand the dual nature of Christ, vera homo, vera deus. They don't get all of that. They're not quite sure what the incarnation is, and they're sure not real clear about the kingdom, but they do know that if they just touch his garment, they're going to be healed, and they come at this rudimentary level. And then Mark shocks us because he says, as many as touched him were, and it's usually translated made well, but the Greek word is sodzonto, they were saved. Salvation in the New Testament is a rich and multifaceted word. We think of salvation in terms of personal salvation through faith in Christ, but it's even broader than that. It means a complete restoration of health, body, soul, mind, heart, spirit, the whole package, the whole enchilada of what you are is restored to fullness and soundness of health. In other words, to put it simply, they got a lot more than they bargained for. They came just wanting to touch his garment, just wanting to see a healing of a simple malady, and something happened that reached much more deeply into who they really were and transformed them. Mark wants us to see it from the inside out. So whatever they received at that point, it was much more than their expectations had led them to anticipate. We've seen the same thing, of course, down through Christian history. We send out missionaries, and sometimes they go into the most deprived circumstances of the world, third world situations, and we've seen pictures. I grew up as a little kid seeing the missionary slides, you know. That was my steady diet in my little Baptist church there, and all of these pictures of people coming from a long way, sometimes standing in line just for the most modest help at a little Christian clinic that was set up somewhere or other. And how many times have they gotten so much more than they bargained for? How many times did they come simply for a bowl of rice and they got something vastly more than their expectations had led them to expect? We have the same kind of thing going on, of course, here in Spokane. We have these wonderful ministries, people in this church heavily involved, Christ Clinic, Christ Kitchen, set up to provide simple provision, simple help, education, health care, reduced cost, sometimes no cost. People come simply for that provision of something so basic. Sometimes they get a lot more than they bargained for. You know, if you don't believe it, read the books by Jan Martinez, and she'll tell you I'm getting excited about this, you know. I hope it still works. Yes, okay, good. Bobby will be in here yelling at me for destroying church property. I don't want to do that. People that have come, and as she records in her writings, and some of you know the stories personally of people who have just been so deeply helped. They've gotten so much more from Christ Kitchen or Christ Clinic than they bought. This is the nature of serving Christ. We're always delivering more than people expected, you know. And this has been the story of grace down through history. And so what we see here in Jesus, what he models for us, has been an important part of the entire story of the Christian movement, except for the nitpickers. Then the Pharisees and some of the scribes came together to him, having come from Jerusalem. Mark wants us to see the contrast. In fact, it would have been better, in my opinion, that this little last paragraph of chapter 6 should have been part of chapter 7, because the contrast is the point. All of this extravagant, wonderful, dramatic, unbelievable expressions of God's grace being poured out and people's lives being changed, and who could see all of this? and not just be overwhelmed with gratitude of the goodness of God? Answer, the Pharisees, Read a whole lot of us who have this tendency to fixate on what's wrong. And so here they came from Jerusalem, a startling contrast, professional fault finders who were looking for something to whine about in the midst of this lavish display of God's goodness. I spent a fair amount of time last year in our studies of Mark doing something of a history of the Pharisees and something of what their status was in the Jewish community. So I'm not going to go back to that. We haven't talked about them since chapter 2. But I do want to add a little footnote to what we've already said. And so the footnote comes at this point because it really does help us understand the particulars of the present story. At the time that Jesus was doing these things, there were two broadly accepted schools of thought among the Pharisees. One of them represented a school of Hillel. Hillel had died about 20 years earlier than the present events. He had eventually become the head of the Sanhedrin. He was a widely respected man, a rather gentle spirit. He lived a modest life. He was a woodcutter. He was a gentle humanitarian. He was considered the father of more liberal Pharisaical thought. That may sound oxymoronic, but actually the Pharisees had a rather complex internal culture. And there were those who were a little bit softer and more gentle in their approach, and Hillel was really the father of that particular perspective. And then there was another school of thought, kind of the next generation, much more severe. This was a fellow by the name of Shammai. Shammai died just shortly after the events we're looking at right now. He died in 30 A.D. He was regarded as much more severe, quick-tempered. He was associated with more rigid and conservative and demanding standards among the Pharisees. So you had a little bit of an inter-mural debate going on, even among the Pharisees, on a variety of points. And one of the most interesting points where they differed was precisely the point we're dealing with here. How long do you have to wash your hands? That's a major issue. I think we should all be considering that. These two, Shammai, Hillel, had actually disagreed themselves during their lifetimes, the young man and the old man. But their disagreement was rather polite, and there was a certain degree of mutual respect. But as often is the case, the followers, became much more rigid and kind of uncompromising in their perspectives. And so you had a rather sharp division by the time we reach, say, 29 A.D., which is about where we are right here. And it's precisely that question that is being put to Jesus. So here are maybe representatives of both schools of thought showing up, probably inviting Jesus to take sides. Which school of thought are you in, Jesus? And no matter what he answers at this point, he's going to be in trouble with somebody. But of course, not surprisingly, what we find is Jesus just rises above the whole debate. His treatment of this issue is virtually ignored in terms of the vastly greater principle that he's going to announce. We're going to see a little bit of it this week, but more next week when we find he really does establish an entirely new view of what this whole hand-washing thing is missing. And so we'll have to hold off until a little later to see all of it. But anyway, that seems to be what's driving the question. So these guys who are experts, they show up. They're surrounded by folks who are coming to Jesus. They're touching his clothing. They're having Jesus lay hands on them. They're being healed, an amazing, dramatic display of God's goodness. But they keep wanting to tap him on the shoulder and say, hey, excuse me, we have a question for you. Like interrupt all of this because something really burning is in their minds about washing your hands. And so that's what they want to ask him about. And their technical questions are being put to him here. I think you'd have to say there's a little bit of an obliviousness that is suggested here. The sweeping power of Jesus for good is being virtually ignored as they obsess over what amounts to a rather subtle exercise in drawing lines. It's the classic debate in the New Testament between grace and law. Grace is all about all the good things we can and should do. Law is about those things where we're supposed to stop short of crossing over into sinful behavior. Whenever I find myself preoccupied with drawing lines, where do I draw the line? What's exactly that's not a healthy sign. Classically in philosophy and ethics, you've got what's called the golden rule and the silver rule. The golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's an affirmative principle. Go out, there's no limit to the good you can do. No one's going to, throw you in jail for being too good. The silver rule, don't do unto others what you wouldn't want them to do unto you. You see, it's more of a negative rule. It's a rule of restriction. It's a rule of drawing lines. Jesus, uniquely in the history of ethical consideration, comes with a golden rule that exceeds the rule of Confucius, the rule of Buddha, the rule of other enlightened thinkers who had announced what amounted to a silver rule. He goes beyond it. He goes beyond grace, or beyond law, into grace. We are not under law. We are under grace. But these Pharisees hadn't quite got there yet, and they're still very much preoccupied with the rules. They always want to fixate on lines because lines help you define who's in and who's out. You see. The nice thing about a line is if you're on one side and someone else is on another, it creates a neat distinction. And I can say I'm the insider, you not so much. Lines are wonderful for that, for making me feel good about myself by putting someone else in a different, inferior class. This story is a conflict story. We've had 5 of them so far. All the first 5 were in chapter 2. Remember that? We did that early last year. The 5 conflict stories, the last of them is the first part of chapter 3. And then we haven't heard boo from the Pharisees for 4 straight chapters. The rest of chapter 3, 4, 5, and 6, not a word from the Pharisees. And now they show up again, and we have another conflict story. It's the 6th of the conflict stories. It's the penultimate conflict story. The last of them is Holy Week, the 7th conflict story that culminates in the events that appear to have Jesus lose the conflict, right? This is the one that's running up to it. The last in the first half of Mark, leading to that ultimate one. Just think about the conflict stories that we saw in chapter 2. Each one involves Jesus reaching across a divide. Every one of them, Jesus reaches across a line that the legalists had drawn. They had drawn a line to make themselves feel good about themselves. Jesus reaches across the line, scandalizes them by obliterating the line, and each of those conflicts, therefore, represents Jesus replacing line-drawing legalism with grace and gospel. The first of them, he forgives the sin. My son, your sins are forgiven. He reaches across the line to touch a sinful man. The second of them, he reaches across a line to call Levi, a man who was dishonorable and despicable to the Pharisees. The third one, he reaches across a line to reach those who were not disciplined enough to engage in all the fasting behavior of the Pharisees. And the fourth one, he reaches across a line to call those who are weary. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Here are people weary with all the burdensome rules that have become associated with the Sabbath, making it such a horrific weight on their shoulder, and Jesus calls these people out of that. The fifth one, he reaches across a line to someone who had been broken, implied in the story, broken through his own irresponsibility, but Jesus calls this broken man. The most dramatic example of all of Jesus reaching across a line is now he's going to be reaching to the Gentiles. The Gentiles were worse than any of the rest of these folks, you see. The Gentile, that was the most unthinkable thing. That Jesus now, who's supposed to be the Jewish Messiah, would take his message of the kingdom to the Gentiles. Next week we're going to see the first of those stories, the Syrophoenician woman who wants to have Jesus heal her daughter. And Jesus, of course, playing on that impression that comes out of the Jewish world. It's not right to take the bread and throw it to the dogs. We're going to talk about that next week. I'll rehabilitate that statement a little bit. But he's reaching across the line too, from the Jewish point of view, the Gentile dogs. That's exactly what it means, you see. And this becomes maybe the most dramatic expression of all. The final conflict story, he reaches across the divide to all of us. The cross tears in two the veil that kept us out. That ultimate line that separated us from a holy God, the most important line of all, that makes all the rest of the lines we draw become absolutely irrelevant. The one line that really matters, being able to come before God. And Jesus rips away that line with grace. So all the conflict stories are sort of heading toward that destination. And this is the as I say, penultimate of them that comes before us here. All right. Now, when they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled, that is, unwashed hands, they found fault. The word for defiled is actually the word koines. You know the word koine. We get the word coinage from that. It means common, vulgar, the currency. The New Testament was written in koine Greek. Common Greek, vulgar Greek, street Greek, marketplace Greek, you see. It wasn't a high holy language. It certainly wasn't as sophisticated as the language used by Plato or Aristotle. It was a boiled down, dumbed down language that was spoken in the marketplace around the Hellenistic world. That was the language of the New Testament. Common language, vulgar language. And now we have vulgar hands, common hands. And the Pharisees are concerned that people are eating with these coinage hands, you see, these common hands. The washing ritual by the Pharisees that was so famous was not a hygienic thing. I mean, I'm sure there were some hygienic benefits to it, but it was way, way beyond anything that simple hygiene might have required. It represented this kind of inter-mural debate among the Pharisees as to how diligently did you need to wash your hands. The fundamental question driving the debate was how clean do you have to get to be truly an insider, inside the line, you see. How clean do your hands have to be? Well, they go and find Jesus healing people and doing all this stuff, and then they notice a couple of disciples have grabbed a sandwich and they didn't wash their hands. And the Pharisees go apoplectic. Everything that Jesus was doing that was good is eclipsed by not washing your hands, you see. And so they seize on it. They're fault finders. The New Testament never calls us to be fault finders, you know that? It does call us to be virtue finders. Now, I should say I'm speaking a little extravagantly. We should be fault finders when we examine our own hearts. That's you know, there's something to be said for that. But the attitude of going around finding fault is not very healthy, is it? Am I the only one in the room? I don't know. I mean, I have to say, I'm embarrassed. Now, never in our church. I want to make it clear. You know, I've never found fault in any sermon in our church, ever. So just get that on the record. But I've heard some sermons, and I found myself finding fault. Ding, 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 a little bit of heresy there. Oh, that was a misstatement of that verse. Oh, bing, 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 you know, like a little computer running. Bing, 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 fault finding. What is that? Why do we do that? What is this impulse within us? The New Testament says, whatsoever things are good, whatsoever things are virtuous, whatsoever things are holy, whatsoever things are noble, whatsoever things are lovely, whatsoever things are of good report, think on those things. You know how little time of my life I've spent doing that? It is hard to do because it's so easy to find fault. And these guys were good at it. But I don't know that that's any great virtue because I think actually we're all good at it. We all are pretty good at finding fault. So they're doing this. Mark gives us a little editorial explanation of what's going on here. Many translations put this two-verse statement in parens because it is Mark's addition to the story. For the Pharisees and all the Jews do not eat unless they wash their hands in a special way, holding the tradition of the elders. The Pharisees, this is documented, some of them regarded eating with unwashed hands a greater sin than sexual crimes. Adultery was less serious than eating with unwashed hands. In fact, in church history, to our embarrassment, there have been those who've held that. There's at least a couple of chapters in church history where people viewed eating an egg during Lent as a more serious crime than committing adultery. You see. Now that's a little bit upside down, don't you think? Something about that is a little bit cockeyed. It is a form of legalism that is called moralism. Moralism is the business of substituting relatively easy rules and putting them in place of rules which Jesus calls the weightier matters of the law. What I'm called to live as a Christian person is a pretty high and holy standard, you know. But if I can find a few substitutes to stick in there and get real diligent about doing those things and sort of excuse myself from the weightier matters of the law, then I can feel good about myself while at the same time not quite meeting those standards that I should be thinking about. Jesus says you should have done these things but not omitted the weightier matters of the law. I grew up in a little, and I don't say this to be disparaging, but it is truthful, in a little rural Baptist church. I've told you that before. And I remember sermons that were preached in that little Baptist church in which I think I grew up with the impression that the great cardinal sins, the great crimes that we should at all cost avoid are playing cards, never go to a movie, good heavens, certainly don't go to a dance, you know, anything like that, or drinking wine, anything like that. Those were the subject matter of sermon after sermon after sermon. I remember a sermon preached by my beloved pastor who had a great influence in my life way back when I was a kid, in which he was pointing out the evils of a TV show that had just come on, which no good Christian should ever watch. You know what it was called? American Bandstand. And that evil guy, Dick Clark, actually putting on TV for people to consume, dancing. Look at those gyrations. He would use that language, you see. And I'm wondering now, in retrospect, if that was omitting some of the weightier matters of the law. You know, I mean, whatever your thinking is about dancing, are there some other things we should be thinking about here? I remember one guy, he was a Sunday school teacher of mine, a wonderful man. His name was Al Jarreau, no relation to the Al Jarreau you've heard of. He had come from Quebec. He was a wonderful guy. He was just a great Christian man. He was the general manager of the Safeway store in Grand Coulee, Washington. He got preached out of the church by a pastor who, thankfully, was only there 1 year, who every week would get up and preach about the sins of selling liquor, because that Safeway store sold wine and beer. And every week he would mention that somewhere until finally the guy said, enough. And he took his family and left the church, came back some months later, very much welcomed by everybody else because we knew him to be a godly man. I loved the man. This was when I was about 10 years old. Fixating, fault-finding, you see. Well, you don't have to go 100 years ago to my little Baptist church to find it. I will say that, as long as I'm on this little personal narrative here, when my beloved mother, along with my dad, are both with the Lord now, first joined First Presbyterian Church in 1975, she told me repeatedly she just couldn't believe the difference. She didn't walk out of church feeling guilty. Hearing Dick Leon preach every week, she said she just felt buoyed up to go and live like a Christian, rather than when she used to just feel beat down by all the things that may not have been the weightier matters of the law. You know, it's a warning that we all need to take to heart. And I don't say this again to be disparaging about my own wonderful tradition, but I think that's at least one point where I think there may have been a little bit of lack of balance. Well, Mark tells us all of the Jews engaged in this. That may be a bit of hyperbole, but it is true that Mark was writing to Jewish people as well as Gentile people in Rome, and we know that those Jewish folks in Rome did in fact have some pretty heavy Pharisaical influence among them, so he may have been being closer to the mark than we might think. Mark says they wash their hands in a special way. Literally it reads a clenched fist, which is simply a sort of colloquialism for diligently, scrubbing up. You would think this was a surgeon going into major surgery. They'd scrub and scrub and scrub, you see. It was that kind of thing. Now, we like it when physicians do that. Don't get me wrong. That's fine, you know. But when the Pharisees were doing it before they were going to eat an apple, and then they'd give the apple the same treatment, then you kind of wonder if that was altogether balanced. Why did they do this? Well, it's what Mark calls the tradition of the elders. There was in the Jewish world an understanding of two sources of authority for Jewish people. One was the written law, the Torah, but there was a theory in which Moses allegedly not only received the written law, the Ten Commandments, 2 stones and all of that, but he also received an oral instruction on Mount Sinai, and he passed it on orally to his successors. And it continued to be transmitted orally, so the story went, until eventually it was written down in what was called the Talmud. And so the Talmud was the tradition of the elders, and it was held to be an understanding of the Torah that the word was used was fenced the Torah, fenced it. What that meant was that whatever the Torah said on its face needed to be understood in light of the interpretive authority of the Talmud, which in effect put the Talmud slightly ahead of the Torah, because it could in some cases overrule what seemed to be the plain sense of the Torah. Some of you recognize that's not too dissimilar from a Roman Catholic understanding of dual source authority in the Catholic Church. I'm not saying this again to be critical, it's just a fact, and any good Catholic would agree with me here, that there are two sources of authority, the Bible and the tradition of the church. And the tradition of the church authoritatively interprets the Bible. I've had this conversation with my close Catholic friends more than once. And what we wind up with is a disagreement over what a verse says, in which I'm being trumped, not by the plain sense of the verse, but by the tradition of the church, which tells me that's not a legitimate way to view that verse, you see. Well, how do I argue with that? At that point, if I accept the authority of the tradition of the church, then the debate's over. Same kind of thing going on here. And that's precisely what Jesus criticizes on more than one occasion, substituting the tradition of man for the Word of God. And we're leading up to that, something like that even here. When they came from the marketplace, or when they come from the marketplace, they do not eat unless they wash. There are many other things which they have received in whole, like the washing of cups, pitchers, copper vessels, and couches. Some have thought on occasion over the years they were overstating the point, but archaeology has really vindicated what Mark is saying here. This is an archaeological find in Jerusalem of an upper-class home that was filled with little washing pools, all kinds of them for various purposes. About 25% of the Mishnah, which was another important Jewish writing of the day, treats simple questions of purity. And so what's going on in Mark's description of it is pretty close to what actually was going on in the day, as we've discovered from external sources. It was a bit of a cultural obsession, and especially among the Pharisees, a huge amount of life was devoted to these meticulous washing rites. They might foreclose on a widow's house. They might engage in very shady business dealings elsewhere. Their moral level of observance might be a little bit shaky at points, but they were really good at washing their hands, you see. And that was how they would justify maybe compromise elsewhere. The word for washing here, by the way, is baptismos, from the Greek verb baptizo, to baptize. And that's why, somewhat humorously, Justin Martyr, writing in the 2nd century about these people, called them Baptists. But no connection, friends, to the Baptists that came later in history. It just is a little accident of language in history. All right, Mark returns to his narrative. Then the Pharisees and scribes asked him, Why do your disciples not walk according to the tradition of the elders, but eat bread with unwashed hands? Why don't they live according to the Talmud? Why do they eat with unwashed hands? The practice of washing hands is not present in Moses. He doesn't have a whole lot to say about it. There are some washing rites in the Old Testament, but this kind of elaborate hand-washing ritual is really not present in Moses' teaching, but the principle undergirding it is. Moses made the distinction, as you know, between the clean and the unclean, and it's quite an elaborate set of distinctions. Clean and unclean places, objects, people, disease conditions, foods, all of these fall within the parameters of a distinction between the clean and the unclean, as you know. It represents an Old Testament paradigm that God has established, as it were, a sterile field in an unclean world. The heart of that sterile field is called the Holy of Holies. It purifies its immediate surrounding in that conception of things. So you want to be inside the camp where things are clean, not outside the camp where things are unclean. And this working idea through the Old Testament had a very important pedagogical point, which of course reaches its culminating expression with Christ, who can then set aside, as it were, the scaffolding that was teaching people about this as he replaces it with the hardcore truth that we are all, in a sense, unclean and we all need redemption through Christ. So there's kind of the big picture. But the Pharisees had grabbed that idea of the clean and the unclean, and especially with respect to certain rituals, turned the observance into elaborate, burdensome, frivolous rites of washing and so on that really lost the point entirely, but looked really impressive. Paul probably has something like that in mind when in Colossians he says, "These things indeed have an appearance of wisdom in self-imposed religion, false humility, neglect of the body, but are of no value against the indulgence of the flesh." It looks pretty impressive, but it doesn't get you anywhere when it comes to the deeper matters of true virtue and grace in your heart. The practice, I suppose, from Jesus' point of view, was trivially unimportant. He could have brushed it off, but he recognized, and Mark wants us to appreciate, that hiding behind this whole washing the hands deal was something deeply significant. And so Mark spends a lot of time on it, more than we're going to cover this morning. Jesus says, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you hypocrites. As it is written, this people honors me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain they do worship me, teaching human precepts as doctrines. You abandon the commandment of God and hold to human tradition. Isaiah, of course, had ripped the mask off this kind of charade religion way back in his day. This was nothing new. Jesus wasn't pulling out de novo some deep and different insight into things. Your Greek lesson for the day, hypokriton, from which we get the word hypocrito, hypocrite. Two words, hupo means under. I just had my flu shot Friday. It was a hypodermic needle. Hypodermis goes under the skin, hupo. And it still hurts, by the way. Kriton, from which we get words like crisis, critical, and so on, has to do with judgment. Judgment has to do with exposing what things really are. To judge something is to expose its true nature. Hypokriton means to go under judgment, that is, to obscure the true nature of something. And it was the word that had been coined in Greek history way back when the Greeks invented theater and came up with a word for those who were the actors. They were called hypocrites, you see. It had no religious overtones whatsoever. It was just their two-bit word for actors, people who went up on the stage, and they wore prosopa. Prosopa were masks. They would put the mask over their face and thus conceal the reality of who they were, taking on the persona of somebody else, and thus they were called actors because they engaged in that kind of behavior. And of course that's become the classic symbol really for theatrical arts, those masks of various facial expressions and so on. So the word hypocrite didn't have the baggage when Jesus used it in his day that we associate with it. We have a very, of course, negative sense of the connotations of the word, but Jesus was saying something more on the order of, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you bunch of actors. You know, you're play actors, you're pretenders, you're pretty good at it. There's a little detail here that's very interesting. As Mark renders the text, it says, Isaiah prophesied rightly about you, the hypocrites. The definite article is present, as if to say, you really take the cake, you know. You deserve an Oscar. You guys are amazing at the level to which you can act the role of this religious devotion. But what does it amount to? All the pomp, all the circumstance, all the ceremony, all the show, all the splendor is in vain. And this is the little soul searching we need to all do. How much do we abandon, that is, release, leave behind, dismiss the commandment of God, and hold on tooth and nail, krateo is the sense of the word, to comfortable substitutes for genuine devotion and obedience to Christ? One commentator gave a great quote concerning Gulliver's visit among the Lilliputians. Remember that? He says, quote, reminiscent of Gulliver's voyage to Lilliput and the wrangle between the party which believed that an egg should be cracked at the big end and the party which believed it should be cracked at the little end. So the big enders and the little enders fought to the death, to the complete ruin of their country, you know. There's been a little of that in church history, where we fixate on big end and little end cracked eggs and miss something of the bigger story. All right, quickly, Sunday school lesson. Let's work, friends, to be virtue finders. I especially want you to apply that principle when you come to Sunday school, you know. I know there's plenty in these lessons that's just rich fodder for fault finding. I realize that. You know, there's a lot of stuff to work with here. But let's all work together to find what's good, because we all need it. I need it. We all need it. Let's be virtue finders. When we hear a sermon, when we hear anything that happens in the church or out of it, even political speeches, I mean, I know it's tough, but let's be virtue finders. This has been the distinct calling card of genuine Christians down through history. Let's avoid letting our inter-mural debates, even as Presbyterians, obscure the weightier matters of the law, Christian vision and duty. We've got inter-mural debates as Presbyterians, even in this room. I'm going to tell you, we've got some differences of opinion on some stuff, and some of it's important. But none of it is important as the transforming power of God's grace in a world that desperately needs to hear His message. And so let's not get all twisted up in things that have a certain degree of importance but are not the weightier matters of the law. Let's keep our perspective and our priorities. You know, I think this story wants to remind us of that. Finally, let's be ruthless in distinguishing mask from reality in our self-examination as we serve in the name of the one who was reality itself, truth itself. My first two principles here are telling us to be very gracious toward other folks who may not quite be on all fours with we are on a variety of points, but let's just have a certain degree of latitude and appreciation for a variety of ways in which God is working in this world. When it comes to examining our own hearts, let's be ruthless. Let's look for any twinge, any hint of duplicity, of hypocrisy, of dissimulation, of secrecy, of those things that aren't compatible with God's grace. At that point, let's bring ourselves before God and ask Him, as the psalmist says, examine me and see if there is in my heart any wicked way. That idea of being transparent before God becomes transparency before others, and that is a very Christ-like virtue.